What do you see or envision as the posture of leaders in this moment? What would that posture be that would help contribute to a truly just and equitable future?
I mean, the postures would include one that just without discussion or dialogue suspends the physics of white supremacy. And that means we stop what we're doing. We stop gathering like this in ways that both we talk about dismantling while reinforcing all at the same time. We stop acting as if we can legislate, build policy for, develop practices and programs for communities when we don't have those perspectives around our tables. We understand what's broken in our own systems that are getting in the way of recruiting and attracting and retaining the perspectives and voices that we need and must have out there. And we also are brutally honest with ourselves about when the DNA of our own systems and structures is so sick with the supremacy that they themselves have to be dismantled. And I mean this in the most loving way. And Ilana, you invited the question, and so I'm going to take the invitation sincerely. Particularly for women, and I don't live my life as a white woman, so I don't know, but I spend lots of time with white women. And so I would say I'm showered with microaggressions on a daily basis in a lot of ways, because my experience, this is not my life experience, but it's something I've been on part of the equation, and I get to work with a lot of amazing white women. I understand that there's a reinforcing of behaviors that are gendered, but those gendered behaviors are also deeply rooted in keeping white women in their places. And keeping white women in roles that allow for the continuation of supremacy in ways that might make us all feel liberated, but really it's just a veil that keeps us high functioning so that society can continue, or the Jewish community can continue, or life can continue as it is. And so many see themselves as progressive. So many see themselves well-meaning until they end up in Central Park with their dog off leash because they are breaking the rules and they are acting illegally. And then these well-meaning progressive people leverage the most vile and dangerous tool out there, which is not about Mr. Cooper being a Black man, but the threat of the relationship between police brutality and Black men. They leverage the threat of violence against Black men as perpetuated by the police department to put Black men in their place. And so there's something really, really wrong with every group of women. Black women, we have our own issues, right? But there's something really, really wrong with systems that both tell us we are free and then make sure we're not that free to keep the larger systems highly functioning. And there's something really wrong with having us get intoxicated by giving us a little bit of power when that intoxication is disabling us from being in our full power, because that full power would require us to interrogate these systems and structures. They would demand that we become dissatisfied with them, and they would force us to dismantle and then rebuild them. And so, I'm of the belief, and you're talking to somebody who just got finished reading for the second time, Decolonizing Wealth. And so I have my own perspectives and how they're informed, but there is no organization in the Jewish community, not even the Jews of Color Initiative, that is only staffed by people of color. But there is no Jewish organization in the Jewish community that doesn't have supremacy in its DNA. Every organization was built on the premises of colonization and subjugation. Every foundation we have got its wealth off the backs of somebody else, and probably hasn't done the work of reparations in that regard. Every organization, even organizations that support Jews of color or women or whatever, we're all caught up in a reflexive loop. That both allows us to both advance power, but at the same time doing it at the cost of somebody else. And so what do I think about the architecture? I'm we need new architects. What do I think about the blueprints? I'm throw them out, burn them up, and let's create new ones. And not because I think it's about taking an aggressive or kind of dramatic stance or approach with any of these issues. It's because we have to recognize that the core of our organizations are built on the marginalization of others. And the reality of our own power is based on taking away power from other people. And if we don't have the consciousness to talk about it, the language to be able to explore it, the tools to be able to understand it, the rigor to be able to dismantle it, then we can't rely on ourselves to create any kind of freedom out there.
Thank you, Ilana. Something that you shared as far as how this system that we exist in, that I refer to as kind of the systems within systems of oppression, really do function to keep everyone in their place. And that actually ties into, and recognizing what that looks like for predominantly white women in the Jewish nonprofit sector, is that there is a way in which they are being oppressed both by that gendered system and are also engaging in an anti-Black oppression and other discrimination. So I wanted to just lead into this next question for Gali from our audience, which was, can you talk about the ways that the pressure on CEOs, majority men, is trickling down to the majority of senior staff who are women? How can we support women senior directors? And just as an anecdote for myself, as someone who went through the 2008 downturn in the Jewish communal space and is starting to see how these most recent rounds of layoffs and furloughs are going, I have an acute awareness that we do have an issue in our community that the top roles are primarily men. The second, number 2 role are primarily women. And those are the folks that get to do the dirty work. So those are the folks that are doing the layoffs. A lot of the times, those are the folks that are the HR people, the communications people, the internal talent development folks, the senior managers that have pushed really hard, juggling, in many cases, not healthy expectations around work-life integration, other issues that are now being put in this position. And so I would love to hear from Gali kind of what some of the things, and Alicia, what some of the things you're hearing about from women that are in that role in terms of the staff role, from Gali, and then also from Alicia as far as the role that board women are in.
Sure. 1,000%. Yeah, like snaps all around, like 100%. We know that the majority of our organizations are led by white men, and many of them have senior leadership teams that are composed mostly of white women, and they are absolutely the ones that have to carry forward a bunch of work. What we're seeing in many ways, this is indicative to, every year we do, except for this year, we do an employee experience survey to try and get a sense of like, okay, employees, how are you experiencing work? And this is a proxy for us to understand, like, are Jewish organizations great places to work? Like, are we able to attract like the kind of talent that can then, be able to maximize their potential because they have the tools, they have the good management, they have the kind of strategy and clear goals that, essentially we want out of every employee who's able to give the majority of their waking hours to work. So one of the ways in which we know that we are, in fact, y'all, not great places to work yet, but we're striving, is 2 factors. One is our managers really don't know how to manage. Like, we are not trained in that. We are too busy doing a bunch of work, right? And we don't know how to really do that in a way that enables people to really grow and stretch and think about their next phase. The second has to do with internal communications. And that is really spliced. The bigger the organization, also the harder it is to streamline, to get some sense of like, how does that energy move around the organizations? So what we saw initially with COVID was that both of those things were really ameliorated. They were really improved because all of us, all of a sudden, were on Zoom. And managers knew that they had to check in with their folks. Like, there was such disruption in the beginning that what we heard from really the senior leadership teams is, I'm checking in with my team like more than ever before. They're seeing more of me than ever before. And we heard that from employees. There was a lot of appreciation. Then, we thought we were going to do this for like 2 weeks. Into 3 months here, what happened as we continued was that senior staff, and in some cases that's only the CEO with like a strategy consultant, or with the board, potentially, maybe the senior staff, the senior leadership team doing this, they're in meetings essentially all the time thinking, how are we pivoting? How are we meeting this moment? We have to change. That's the only constant. That's the only know that we need to do. First, it was the budget. How can we cut costs and preserve cash? Then it was, let's make sure that we have the right team on the bus. Now it's, this is a new world. How are we going to be relevant? All of a sudden, we had 350 people show up to services on Friday night as opposed to 35, and that was over Zoom. What does that mean for us? And those are senior staff. That's essentially the CEO really leading those conversations. And what we're seeing is that there's a chasm. There's like a big, big, big gap between like the conversationing happening at that level and how that gets filtered down to the rest of the teams. It doesn't get filtered down. So you have a bunch of senior leaders who are women who are like, hi, where are we going? Can you like give me some sense of like what the plan is, because they're not in those rooms where decisions are being made. And then you've got a bunch of people throughout the organizations, again, overwhelmingly women, 70% women, if not more, who are also like, ready, willing, able, and are not getting that kind of information to get a sense of, where are we going, let alone being asked like, let's be innovative. Like, where are the ways in which we can, seize this opportunity if we're all going to live through it? So that's a major thing that we're seeing. We're seeing sort of this like really a barrier between like a black box kind of reality of we're trying to figure out our strategy, and the we is generally the CEO in partnership with maybe a select number of senior staff. Sometimes a bunch of the senior staff are not in those because they may be laid off. So like that's a whole other dynamic. And then there are a bunch of, senior leaders who have to continue nurturing and in some ways taking care of a very exhausted workforce. And they themselves are, beyond fried. That I would say is the biggest, like really the way in which this is getting played out. Look, in some situations, we've seen a partnership really grow in the senior leadership team, and actually that helping with some of the exhaustion. But that's been the exception, not the rule.
Thank you so much, Gali. I would love to hear, Alicia, your thoughts on this topic.
So I think if you're talking about communication from the top down, there's even less sort of knowledge with respect to, and I speak this as someone who's now dedicated their entire professional life to working with board members. So let's be clear, this is just constructive, right? Is that most boards that I work with don't understand the composition of the Jewish workforce, right? So let's understand first, right, that they don't understand, like even the 70%, 30%, 70%, everything that we can just say shorthand, like that's not something that like rolls off their tongue. They don't understand necessarily the demographics, all of that, right? That's, it's just something that is not, unless they're spending time and, in working with the survey or actually getting, some extra, sort of development work along that, they don't really understand the totality of the workforce, right? They very much understand what's going on with them. Now, I can tell you that just specifically with respect to kind of this first round of layoffs, right? At least I'll talk on a very local level because this is very hyper local in many cases, right? Talking to sort of what Gali was saying about like who's in charge. I can just, in this case, we can talk about hyper local. I mean, the first round of layoffs here are happening mostly in early childhood, day schools and camps, right? And so I think there is a recognition, right, that to the extent that that's true, right, and they're not higher level administration or heads of school or heads of camps, frankly, in all honesty, that is, there's a dramatic over impact on women, and a question as to what how that's going to work overall. We'll see what happens as layoffs continue, but I do think there is just naming it essentially and talking about it and having discussions around what this is like for the workforce of the Jewish social sector writ large, I think is something that boards could and should be doing, because it's already disproportionately affecting it based on the way the business is going. So.
Thank you so much, Alicia. So I want to thank our distinguished speakers today, and want to just kind of remind ourselves a little bit of who's in the room and some suggestions of next steps as we wrap up this session. The folks that were on this call, which we had over, I think, about 100, It's a mix of senior leaders, staff, board members, funders. I hope in some cases there were multiple folks in different positions from the same agency. I'm sure you also saw some other colleagues from other agencies. I hope that you're jotting down, or that you take the next few minutes to jot down some things that were surprising from this conversation, that were confusing, that were challenging, that were intriguing. And you really set and make that commitment for yourself to have some deeper reflection on it, and to follow up with different folks in your organization to further these conversations. If you are a board member and there were a number of things you heard here, or funder, that just sounded really surprising, shocking, that's fantastic, because the people that are on this call are really top leaders in the field that are really sharing things that we all need to be hearing. So bring those back to your CEOs and senior leaders and share these things that you heard. And so let's have a discussion about it. So there's also a lot of opportunity through the app for folks to kind of peruse who else is at this 2-day convening, to follow up and continue these conversations. So again, I hope that this is just the beginning of a number of really important, meaningful conversations. You're going to have a little bit of a break, and then at 11:15 Pacific, 2:15 East Coast time, we're going to have our closing plenary, which is going to be moderated by Dr. Gali Benchimol, who's the SRE Network Senior Advisor for Research and Learning. It's going to be featuring Dr. Alicia Ackerman and Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg and April Baskin. And the topic is wrestling with repair, teshuva, restorative justice, accountability at the intersections. This session that you just participated in is an excellent segue into that, about how we really build the muscle for acknowledging the harm that we've experienced, the harm that we perpetrated, what we've continued to be a bystander in, and to really develop that muscle as a community to further this work in the coming days and months.